In this short video, my focus is going to be on classical and operant conditioning, but I wanted to show you 3 other topics that you'll want to review and read about in your textbook. Cognitive factors in learning, observational learning, which is learning by observing somebody else first engage or perform a particular behavior or skill. So for example, you may have used a YouTube video that shows you how to do something, such as how to repair a faucet. That is an example of learning how to do something through observation. You also want to read about the biological, cultural, and psychological factors. So by definition, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of the things you do and the experiences that you have. So while your behavior is changing, something else is occurring. There are also biological changes taking place. Your brain actually changes with learning. So every time you learn something new, for example, as you learn new information in watching this video or as a result of taking this course, new connections between neurons in your brain are forming. And so your brain changes as you are learning. So classical conditioning is a type of learning that really helps us explain what are involuntary behaviors. And involuntary behaviors are behaviors that occur without learning. So these are things that occur without your conscious thought. So I want you to take a second and think about something that you do that you think might be an involuntary behavior that occurs automatically, and it's not something that you think about or initiate specifically. So keep your example in mind. And the example that I have are reflexes. So for example, whenever you touch something hot, your hands will automatically pull back. That automatic reflex to pull back your hands is an involuntary behavior. You don't consciously think about it, it automatically occurs. Similarly, if you're tripping and you're about to fall, you would automatically put your hands out to try to catch yourself, to prevent yourself from falling. That's an involuntary behavior because you're not consciously thinking about, I need to put my hands out. It automatically occurs. This is different from operant conditioning, so it's important to keep in mind that classical conditioning helps us explain involuntary behaviors. So I want to walk through Pavlov's classic example to illustrate the process of classical conditioning. So with classical conditioning, there are 4 components. You have the unconditioned stimulus, and this is the stimulus that automatically, without learning, so it's that thing, such as the hot stove or the hot object, that would automatically elicit a response. And in the example of the touching a hot object, the response would be pulling back your hands. So you have the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. And the unconditioned response, otherwise referred to as UR, is the response that occurs automatically in response to this unconditioned stimulus. With classical conditioning, what occurs is that a stimulus that's completely unrelated to the unconditioned stimulus or the unconditioned response is paired with the unconditioned stimulus so that it becomes associated with it such that it will eventually come to cause that response, the unconditioned response, as a result of its association with the unconditioned stimulus. So in Pavlov's example, his unconditioned stimulus was food, and food automatically elicits the response of salivation, causing the dog to increase its saliva production. So presenting food to dog causes an increase in saliva production. However, he used a bell as the stimulus he was going to condition the dog to salivate to. This bell, however, by itself, before it is paired with the food, doesn't cause any salivation when it's rung. The dog won't salivate when it hears a bell ring by itself. However, if we move down to this sort of peach-colored box, through the process of conditioning in which the bell is paired with the food, and so specifically the bell is rung, the food is presented to the dog, and then the dog salivates. And with enough pairings, meaning repeatedly ringing the bell, presenting the food, and the dog salivating as a result, eventually, after conditioning, all Pavlov needed to do was ring the bell, which is ring the bell, and it would cause a response of salivation. So through the process of conditioning by pairing this unrelated stimulus, which is called the neutral stimulus, with the food, eventually this neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus that will elicit the response of salivation. So there are two things I want to point out that will help you remember what is the unconditioned stimulus, what is the conditioned stimulus, and what is the unconditioned response, and what is the unconditioned response, and what is the conditioned response. So in classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are always different. So in an exam question, if you were asked to identify the unconditioned stimulus, and you know what the conditioned stimulus is, check to make sure that you don't select the option that's the same as the conditioned stimulus, because the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus will never be the same. And you can see in this example why. The neutral stimulus is something that would never elicit the response, so it has to be different from the unconditioned stimulus. The second thing is, while the neutral stimulus, which is also the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned stimulus are never the same, in contrast, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are either the same or very similar. And the reason is the whole purpose of classical conditioning is to condition a response to a new stimulus that already occurs in response to another stimulus. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to spend some time in the next few days thinking about examples of classical conditioning that might explain some things about your own experience. So see if you can identify any behaviors that you engage in that might reflect classical conditioning. And I encourage you to post them in the concept chat discussion forum this week so we can talk about different examples of classical conditioning and work through those as a group to help all of us better understand classical conditioning in preparation for the exam. So now I want to talk about operant conditioning. And if you recall, I said that classical conditioning helps us explain involuntary behavior. In contrast, operant conditioning helps explain voluntary behavior. So when we choose to engage in certain behaviors. And with operant conditioning, the focus is on really the consequences of the behavior. So whenever we engage in some type of behavior, there are always outcomes, which in operant conditioning terms would be referred to as consequences. With operant conditioning, there are two key principles. One of the principles is reinforcement. And reinforcement essentially is something or whatever, something that might increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring. And there are two types of reinforcement. There are positive reinforcements and there are negative reinforcements. So with positive reinforcement, the behavior is followed by some type of reward. So something rewarding is added. So for example, if you went and had a hard workout, you might reward yourself with your favorite smoothie afterwards for that hard workout, or putting in the time at the gym. Negative reinforcement also increases behavior, but it does it in a different way. With negative reinforcement, the behavior is reinforced by removing something unpleasant. So, for example, whenever you take an aspirin, that behavior of taking the aspirin is reinforced because it removes something unpleasant, which is a headache. So even though in negative reinforcement there's this word negative, it doesn't mean negative in the sense that it's something unpleasant or bad. It means that it is removing something that is not particularly pleasant, but it's still increasing the likelihood that that behavior will occur again in the future. Because in the process of engaging in that behavior, you're removing something that you're not finding pleasant, or you might even be finding unpleasant. So, for example, as I mentioned, taking an aspirin will help remove the pain you're experiencing. So let's walk through an example. So with reinforcement, it always increases the behavior. And so when you are presented with an example of reinforcement, what you want to think about is, what is the effect on behavior? So if the behavior is increasing, that always means the behavior is being reinforced. And there's two ways through which behavior can be reinforced: positively and negatively. So in this example, the behavior is turning in homework on time. One way to increase the likelihood that someone will continue to turn in homework on time is a teacher could praise that child in the classroom. That praise is positive reinforcement because something pleasant is being added. In contrast, another way to reinforce behavior is through negative reinforcement. And again, as a reminder, negative reinforcement is removing something unpleasant. So you can increase the behavior of turning homework in on time by stopping criticizing or checking in with students when they don't turn in their homework on time. So something unpleasant, which is the criticism, is removed when the student turns his homework in on time. Now, in addition to reinforcement, there is also punishment. And punishment is just the opposite of reinforcement. Punishment decreases behavior. While reinforcement increases behavior, punishment decreases behavior. So like reinforcement, we have positive punishment and negative punishment. And the positive only means that something is added. And in the case of positive punishment, something unpleasant is added. So, for example, if an athlete arrives to practice late, a coach may punish that athlete by having that athlete run extra laps. So something potentially unpleasant, running extra laps, is added. So that's an example of positive punishment. Negative punishment is when something rewarding is removed as a way of punishment. So when a teenager comes home after curfew, perhaps several times in a row, the parents might take away that teen's car keys and not let the teen go out with his or her friends on the weekends. So being able to drive and go spend time with friends is removed. Essentially, the child is required to stay home or grounded, so unable to go out and spend time with friends. So something pleasant, which is spending time with friends, having their freedom to drive places, is removed because that child consistently over a period of a few days or a few times came home after curfew. And so to punish the child for not following the rules with respect to coming home at a certain time at night, the child is punished, the teenager is punished, and is prevented from going out and spending time with friends as a result of not following those rules. Okay, so let's walk through a specific example here. And again, like with, I'm actually going to change this because this should be punishment. Like with reinforcement, you always want to focus on what the effect is on behavior. And with punishment, the effect should always be a decrease in behavior. If the behavior is increasing, you know it's reinforcement, and if it's decreasing, you know it's punishment. So as similar to the example I just gave, suppose a child comes home 2 hours late after curfew. An example of positive punishment, meaning something is added, could be scolding the child or grounding them. An example of negative punishment might be preventing the child from watching their favorite episode of television shows on TV. So something pleasant is being removed as a way of a punishment. So that would be negative punishment. Now, I want you to look at this box here in the middle, which is the negative reinforcement example, and you might be wondering why it's there. The reason it's there is that sometimes what you might think is punishment is actually reinforcement. So you always want to look at what the effect is on behavior. So I'm going to walk through this example again, and I'm going to come back to the negative reinforcement in a minute, but I want to repeat the first part of this example to help connect it specifically to this concept of negative reinforcement and how it relates to punishment. So when a child or a teenager comes home 2 hours late, the parent could scold that child as a way of punishment, or they could prevent the child from watching the television show. However, the next night, the child comes home 2 hours late again. And so the parent scolds the child again or prevents the child from watching their favorite television show. And again, the next night, the child comes home 2 hours late. So what you should be noticing is that the behavior is not changing. And the whole purpose of punishment is to decrease the behavior. So if the behavior isn't decreasing as a result of the punishment, whether it's scolding or preventing the child from watching their favorite episode on TV, of their favorite TV show, the next question ought to be, could I be reinforcing that behavior? And one way in which coming home late could be reinforced is that the child is missing something unpleasant, which is chores or washing dishes. So something unpleasant is removed, that's negative reinforcement, by coming home late. Likewise, scolding might even be an example of positive positive reinforcement. Because the child might be getting attention from the parents, and that might actually be reinforcing to the child. So if the behavior doesn't decrease as a result of the application of punishment, the question always is, what, or if, or more specifically, could the punishment be somehow reinforcing the behavior? Or is there something else explaining why this behavior is being reinforced, such as the fact that the child is able to also miss chores, and that's actually more reinforcing than scolding is punishing, or the scolding itself isn't as unpleasant as missing chores is pleasant. By missing chores could be more reinforcing than the scolding is punishing. So this concludes the video related to operant and classical conditioning. One thing to remember again about operant conditioning is that positive means something is added and negative means something is removed. And reinforcement, the purpose of reinforcement is to increase the behavior, whereas the purpose of punishment is to decrease the behavior. And you can do that through positive or negative reinforcement or positive or negative punishment. And it's always important to think about what are the effects on behavior in determining whether or not, one, the punishments or reinforcements are effective, and two, whether or not they're having their intended effects, meaning decreasing behavior or increasing behavior in the case of reinforcement, or decreasing behavior in the case of punishment. So if you have any questions about operant and classical conditioning, please post them in the concept chat discussion area, as well as please post any examples of classical conditioning as well as operant conditioning that you're seeing in your own experience or in people around you in your everyday life to the concept chat discussion forum.